Hey everybody, welcome to the RISD Career Center on-demand tutorial on resumes and cover letters. This webinar is being presented by myself, Scott Malloy. I'm Senior Career Advisor, and I'm joined by my colleague, Susan Anderson, Associate Director of the RISD Career Center. For you all to have a kind of sense of the agenda and what we're going to be covering today, this session will focus on 3 key topics. Number 1, we're going to do a deep dive into the content and format for resumes used to apply for internships and jobs, teaching positions, and artist opportunities such as exhibitions, grants, and residencies. Number 2, we're going to discuss ways to tailor your resume for your audiences, highlighting your strengths, skills, and the most related experiences. And lastly, we're also going to tackle how to write cover letters and emails that effectively communicate your strengths and fit for the opportunity that you want. We should also note that beyond this video tutorial that you're watching right now, you should know that just in general, the Career Center staff is also here to support you. So if you have questions about this tutorial or your professional next steps in general, please feel free to contact us via our email at risdcareers@risd.edu. We're also available daily during specific hours for remote drop-in advising sessions for quick career questions, as well as full 30-minute advising appointments. And you can go to our website to schedule an appointment or access those remote drop-in hours by going to careercenter.risd.edu/meet-us. It's also the Meet Us section of our website. If you just go to the home page and click on Meet Us, you'll be able to access those resources. So with that said, I think we'll dive right into the topic at hand and discuss resumes and cover letters. So just to jump right in, a key question is, where can you start, right? And one thing that Susan and I want you to be aware of is the fact that on our website, which you're seeing a screenshot of on the screen right now, there's a whole section dedicated to resumes and CVs where we provide guidance, but also provide actual examples that you can reference and kind of use as models for your own resume building needs. And we're going to reference some of those models or working samples today, and I'm going to highlight a few right now just that you'll be seeing throughout the remainder of the presentation here today. So this example, just a little bit more of kind of a graphic design student type example. Maria Santos here, a little bit more of a fine artist, art administrative type resume example. And then Xavier Williams, who is an illustration student kind of pursuing opportunities in gaming. We'll also show and discuss more of a fine art exhibition style resume like you see on the screen right here. And then also more of a CV or a teaching based resume, which you're seeing on the screen currently. We're going to do a deep dive into each and every one of these, but I just wanted to show them up front so you can sort of see the differences really quick and know the types of examples that we're going to be working from moving forward. Having said that, as you probably noticed in the way we were kind of showing different types of resumes there, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that there are different kinds of resumes for different purposes. So I think it's a good starting point to kind of think of those different types of resumes and consider what resume might you be creating for the purpose that you're using it for, right? So one type of resume that I think most people are really quite familiar with is sort of the traditional resume, right? And that's typically a one-page document. And this is the type of resume that you'd be creating if you were applying to a job or an internship or a similar type of professional opportunity. And really the focus here, and as you'll see as we go through, the focus for this kind of resume is really highlighting the experiences and attributes that make you a good candidate for the position, job, or internship that you're applying for. The next version or type of resume is a CV or a curriculum vitae. And this gets a little tricky because the term CV can be used in different ways, and depending on where you are in the world, it can actually mean different things. Speaking for the United States or with a United States focus, CV is usually, that term is usually reserved for if you're talking about a document that you'd use to apply for a teaching position. So it's essentially like a record of your professional, academic, or teaching career. Outside of the US, however, sometimes the terms resume and CV are kind of used interchangeably. So one thing to keep in mind is And, we'll try to reinforce this idea as we go through, but one thing to keep in mind is this idea of like, don't worry so much about what it's called, resume, CV, exhibition resume. Focus more on what the purpose is and allow that to kind of drive how you build and format and structure the resume. So this will make more sense as we go into each version, but just keep that in mind. And then last but not least is more of an exhibition style resume. And this is really serves more as a record of your accomplishments as a fine artist with a specific emphasis on exhibitions and showing your show history. This kind of document is most often provided to galleries and museums, but you might also be submitting it as part of grants, fellowships, scholarships, artistic competitions, or residencies, or those types of fine art opportunities. So that's just to kind of set the stage for these three different versions, what these terms mean and how they're normally defined.
I would just add to that, Scott, that what's also distinctive about these three different versions of professional material that you'll present for yourself potentially is that a resume is almost always a single page document, where the CV and exhibition resumes can be longer documents. So just bear in mind that our focus today, especially on resumes, is to help you achieve a one-page document specifically.
Absolutely. Thank you, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
So with that said, let's dive into that first kind of resume, that traditional resume that's used for applying to jobs and internships. So, just kind of building off of actually Susan's great point there, just some quick core concepts of things you want to keep in mind for this type of resume. Really, your overall goal is to create a document that is informative, that puts across the information that you're trying to communicate, that's consistent in its formatting and the way that it is visually appearing and structured, and that's organized. Essentially, that's easy for somebody to read and easy for somebody to get the information that they want to get to. Resumes are typically read fairly quickly, at least at a first pass, usually under a couple of minutes, 1 to 2 minutes, somebody's giving a resume a quick glance. So you want to make it as easy as possible for that person to get the key information that they need to get. So to that point, as Susan said, definitely want to keep it short and normally want to keep it to one page. There are exceptions, but for the most part, you really want to use that first page to convey the most critical information for your audience. And then the last little kind of key takeaway before we start to break down the different sections of a resume is even though, some color, icons, logos, or other kind of stylized or illustrative elements, even though these can be really, really effective things that help your resume stand out from the crowd, you want to be careful not to overdo it on these stylized elements. In other words, be careful that any kind of stylized element does not distract from the main content of the resume, does not distract from showcasing your skills and experiences. So it's okay to use color or logos or like small graphic icons here and there, but you don't want to overdo it. So you want to be careful that at the end of the day, your skill sets and experiences are what's shining through on the resume. So we're going to go into each of these in more detail. So I'm not going to, do a deep dive on any one of these categories, but I do think it's helpful to all on one screen kind of show you some of the main sections that typically go into a resume. So we'll really quickly kind of scan through all of them. So normally at the top, you would, start with your header, which would include your name and contact info. You'd then possibly, it's a bit more optional, but possibly go into an objective or a summary statement that sort of introduces who you are and what your goals are for the coming year, what your goals are for the things that you're applying to. You'd then move into your educational history, which for all of you is going to contain, what you're studying at RISD. Then another key section you're moving into is a relevant experience or coursework category or studio work category. We'll talk about this a lot as we move through, but this is a key one. Another key one is your skills category that's going to list your relevant skills, typically organized by a category or a type. And then kind of icing on the cake type categories are additional sections like volunteering, awards, exhibitions, clubs. So again, we're going to go into this in more detail, but it's helpful to kind of see these main categories all in one place. Before even, if you're either in the process of building your first resume or you want to update it, and so you're kind of like in that mode right before you get into updating it, or even if you have a resume and you think it's actually pretty effective, I would still give yourself a chance to kind of ask yourself these questions, because I think they're helpful framing questions, or helpful starting points for you to assess if your resume is really working for you. So a couple of key things to think as you're starting out. What kinds of skills and abilities are you hoping to utilize in professional experiences? I think that's a key one, because it's really important that if you have key skills or abilities that you're hoping to use or incorporate into future jobs and internships, you want to make sure that those skills are also being represented in the resume. So it's an important thing to ask yourself before you even go into the building process. 2, what types of organizations are you applying to? So in other words, are you expecting to be applying to design studios, animation studios, museums, a fine artist studio, an art nonprofit? So have an idea in your mind of the kind of place that you plan to be applying to, either for internships and jobs. And the reason why that's important is it sort of feeds into the next question that's listed here. It allows you to sort of project and think about who's going to be reading this resume, who's essentially on the other end of this, or in other words, who is your audience? And then you can start to try to anticipate, what do they want to see? What are the skills and experiences that they're going to want to see in a candidate? And thus you can try to build your resume accordingly. So we'll talk about how to do this, but I think these are really important starting points. So this begs the question, how can you build your resume for your target audience to impress those individuals that you're trying to impress when you apply to internships and jobs? So we're going to break it down section by section. So at the top of your resume, there is almost always, if not always, going to be a header section that includes your basic info. So in this Maria Santos example here, we're going to zoom in and we're going to look at the header section where the callouts are pointing to right there. So a couple of key things. Every resume needs to include contact info and a link to a portfolio website or an online portfolio of some kind. So in this example, you'll see they have a link to their own website, they have their email, and they have their phone number listed. So there needs to be a way for people to see your work, and there also needs to be a way for people to contact you. Now, one of the other pieces of information you see on this is their physical address. In this case, it's a Miami, Florida address. And one of the things that you want to consider with this is, I personally believe, and I know others also who have expertise in resumes think this way as well, that the physical address may be situational, meaning it might be an optional thing that you include sometimes and don't include others. So a way to think about that is, in this case, let's say, Maria Santos is from Miami. Let's say Maria were applying to opportunities in Miami. Including the physical address in that scenario actually makes a lot of sense, because then Maria is seen as a local candidate. People generally like to hire local candidates if they can. They also, it will make them feel good about having that person in for an interview, because it means it's going to be easy for them to come to the studio and interview potentially, if that's a scenario that makes sense. So there's definitely advantages when you are applying locally or applying to a place where you have a physical residence to put that physical residence on the resume. However, the flip side is also true. So if you are applying to places that are not near where you live, so like in this scenario, let's say Maria was applying to places in California, like Los Angeles or San Francisco, for example. In those instances, I may actually advise that they remove their physical address from the resume, because in that case, they're sort of highlighting for the employer that they're far away. And that's not necessarily a good thing to highlight on the resume, at least right at the top before they start to learn anything else about you. So that's why I say, when I say a physical address is situational, that's why I say that. I think it sort of depends on where you're applying and where you live.
When Scott and I were talking about this presentation, one of the other things that came up with regard to this idea of physical address is also that in some instances, students just may not feel comfortable putting their personal contact info on the resume. So I think it's also personal choice that dictates this, naturally. Scott makes great points about the, proximity being a consideration depending on where the places you're applying to. But also remember that you'll have a cover letter or a letter of introduction or an email that you're going to send along with your resume, where you can also reference your proximity and explain your accessibility to the location of the places you're applying to.
Great points. Absolutely great points. And I think Susan's point about personal privacy comes into play in this slide as well, and what we're showing here, which kind of, we had mentioned like this idea of your website and then also your email and phone. I think phone is one of those areas, especially where maybe, the privacy issue comes into play as well. You'll see in this version here, they only have their website and also their email, but they're not comfortable putting their phone number on their resume. And that's acceptable, right? It's everybody's kind of personal level of privacy. To Susan's point, I think it's a great one. And so you are in control of what you do. I think the only takeaway to consider with contact information is they need a way to contact you, right? So you should probably at least have your email on there so that people can follow up with you. But if you're not comfortable with your phone, then you don't need to have the phone on there necessarily, as this example shows.
Sorry
please.
to interrupt you, Scott.
Oh, no, go for it.
I would also add to this, it just occurred to me that I always actually recommend that students use their risd.edu email address, especially if you're actually new to applying to internships or you're just starting your job search. Your RISD email is something that is a great identifier in terms of who you are and where you're coming from. And with that said, if you have a separate Gmail account, I would just encourage you to think carefully about how you're going to monitor and track your responses to your outreach to companies and organizations, which email address are they going to be responding to, and just ensuring that you're very clear with your own purpose and process, and don't miss emails that get sent to your Gmail account versus your RISD account. I would just keep it all with your risd.edu account.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think those are those like small organizational touches that can make the process so much easier. And as you said, make sure that you're keeping track of everything and that nothing falls through the cracks. And I think those are those small little details, but they can prove a big difference and make life easier for you as you're applying things. So I think it's a great point. One last thing before we move on from headers, I think we had talked about kind of stylistic elements that can add value, and you have to be careful, not to have them distract from anything else. But I think the logo here that you see for Xavier Williams is a good example of one that is adding value. It is showing some skill and some creativity, and it's distinct, it stands out, and it's not distracting. So that's not to say that you must have a logo or some like hand-lettered kind of illustrative version of your name or anything like that. But if you feel ambitious and you feel like you have the skill to do something like this, it can be a nice professional touch. So there are these little things that you can do to help your resume stand out. Moving on down, we have next objectives and goal statements, which can add helpful context to your resume. I wouldn't say that they're mandatory, but if they're done right and they're done effectively, they can be good value additions to the resume. So an example of what I mean when we say done right or done effectively is something like this. So relatively short and sweet, it's not going to take up a lot of space. This is really just one sentence. But what they're doing here is they're keeping the focus on their audience, who they want to be working for, or the type of environment they want to be working in, and using this opportunity to kind of draw the reader's attention to specific skills that they have. So I'll read it out loud just to emphasize it. Seeking an opportunity within a nonprofit art center where I can contribute my curatorial, art administrative, and community engagement skills. So again, the two things they really do there is they put the focus on the type of environment. They say a nonprofit art center. They're very focused on where they want to be working. And then they flip that and they say, and here's what I can be offering to that environment, specifically curatorial, art administrative, and community engagement skills. They're doing a nice job of giving a little preview with those three skill sets of saying, here's what you get with Maria Santos, kind of a thing. And that's a nice way for you to summarize for your reader what you bring to the table as an applicant. So that's an example of an effective objective, and that's a good use of space. If you have something that's overly generic or overly bland, and it's maybe just saying something like, I'm seeking an internship opportunity in a creative environment where I can apply my skills, that's not very specific, and any environment could be a creative environment. And what are those specific skills that you're talking about? So you want to make sure if you're doing this, you're being specific and calling attention to the type of place you want to be and also to the skills you want to use.
Another option,
Please.
just to mention, Scott, on that slide. So if you have some experience already as an arts administrator and you've done a lot of work in community engagement, then instead of an objective, you could actually just use those kind of keywords as a very, very quick summary of who you are professionally. Arts administrator plus community engagement, and then go into the rest of the content of the resume. So I bring that up because I've seen students do that really effectively. And it's a nice kind of immediacy of association to who the individual is and how they're thinking of themselves professionally. And assuming that that's the target audience for the resume, that's a fantastic way to lead in with making yourself memorable and being concise and really clear about who you are and what your objectives are. They're implied, by that kind of statement.
Absolutely. Yeah. So depending on where you're at in your career, if you're younger, you have less experience, the type of objective you're seeing on the screen right now may be more appropriate. But as Susan said, if you have more experience, you can kind of lean into that experience and make that a part of your summary statement, and it'll still have similar value, but just a different approach. So I think it's a great point. Regardless of where you're at in your career, though, whether you're a younger student or you're a grad student, or even if you've had some years of working experience, I still do think that the education section is a really key category and a really key section. And I like to think about this as kind of letting RISD work for you, in a sense. Like, you're all working really hard, whether you're a grad or undergrad, you're working hard during your time here, working incredibly hard. So this is your chance to let RISD work for you a little bit. So as you'll see in this example that we're looking at for Xavier Williams, education is really in a prime position on the resume. It's in sort of that upper left-hand corner. It's probably the first thing that you see, aside from Xavier Williams' name and contact information. It's probably the first thing that the person sees. And that's actually intentional. That's actually a good thing, because outside of anything else, right, before anybody else sees your skill set, any of your internship or work experience, any of that, if they see that you're studying or have studied at RISD, that automatically can set you apart potentially from other applicants who maybe don't quite have that level of education or are not at, such an esteemed art and design institution. That's a real advantage for you and can help set you apart. So in, one or two lines, that information can really help you stand out from other applicants. So you want people to see that early on at the top of the resume. So its positioning is actually really important. It can be as simple as you see on the screen here, just Rhode Island School of Design, BFA, your major, or MFA if you're a grad student, and your anticipated year of graduation. It really can be just that simplistic and straightforward. Another version, sorry if I'm moving too fast, another version here, kind of switching to a different resume with Maria Santos. You'll see they have a little bit more information. So they have RISD, they have the location, the city that RISD is based in, they still have their degree, but then they're also adding, in this case, a concentration that they're taking. So their concentration in the history of art and visual culture. So if you are in a concentration, it can be a nice thing to add here. You could also consider adding specific coursework that is unique or that you want to add, you think it adds value. A good example maybe is something like a language that you're studying. If you took a year or two of your college studies to develop language fluency and you took college level coursework in that language, that could be a good thing to add here. So there are other little pieces, whether it's a concentration or specific coursework. Sometimes another example that I've seen people do maybe is if they've taken business coursework or entrepreneurship coursework at Brown, for example, that can be something they'll put there. So you have options. I mean, it's unique to you, of course, but that can be something that you add and also add value to that education section. Once you've accomplished that education section, probably the next thing that's going to come up on your resume as far as the hierarchy, as far as the order, is a section dedicated to experience. But I think with experience, it's really important to keep in mind that experience can be more than just jobs. So I think a lot of times people think of experience and they think like, okay, this section has to be things that I've been paid to do, or it has to be internships, and that's it. Like that's the only thing that's allowed to go into the section. And instead, what I really encourage is for you to think broadly beyond just, oh, these are internships that I've had, or these are paid jobs, part-time jobs that I've had, and really think about experience in a broader way. So if we look at this example from James Yamamoto, you'll sort of see an example of what I'm talking about. So this category does have internships and, you know, paid positions. So it does include those kind of traditional ideas. You can kind of see there's the PS design intern role, the impact agency freelance and intern position, a letterpress production assistant. So, you know, traditional internships are work experiences. However, they also have this printmaking artist mentor, which is kind of more of a volunteer position, but they're including it because it's showcasing a skill in silk screening and printmaking techniques that they think is actually relevant to their audience as a graphic designer. It's showing that they have a knowledge of printing and specific printing techniques, for example. The other thing that they're doing, and it's the last experience that's in the creative experience category, is they have this layout editor position for Visions Magazine, which is actually just, it's essentially like a student-run club, right? It's a student publication. It's not a job. It's not something they were paid to do, but it actually shows, you know, a layout design and publication design skill set that's actually really, really relevant to the world of graphic design that James is applying to. So the only reason I'm kind of highlighting this for you is definitely look holistically at all of your experiences when you're considering your resume and make sure you're not missing anything just because it wasn't an internship or a job. So keep in mind volunteer opportunities, student clubs, freelancing. We're going to show an example in a second that's on the side of courses or kind of referencing courses. So in this example, for Xavier Williams, they're applying to gaming opportunities. They want to be like a concept artist or a character designer in gaming. So one of the things that they do is, in addition to having this gaming experience section, you'll notice towards the bottom, they've also crafted this relevant studios section. And this is a thing that you can all consider for your own resumes as well. Because when you really boil it down, RISD studios really are oftentimes related experience. They are experience in many ways. And it can be a way for you to show your audience that you're developing skill sets and knowledge that's directly applicable to the job or internship that you're applying to. So in this case, they've taken these two classes, a character and environment design course taught in the illustration department, and a 3D illustration course where they actually developed a three-dimensional game. So it shows an understanding of game mechanics and things like that. They're using these courses as relevant experience or as relevant studios, and it's just a way for you to further make your resume even more focused towards your audience and the kinds of things that they want to see. It's something that I really, really encourage and oftentimes work with students on a lot when we're looking at resumes together.
I think that's such an important point, Scott. This idea of how can you best accentuate your skills and kind of turn the question around from what, you know, I think students often think, I don't have enough, or I don't have the experiences that are going to build this resume out in the, you know, like the most dynamic way. And so this idea of really kind of focusing on what your strengths are and the activities that really represent the strengths is a whole nother way you can examine what the experiences are that you're going to be writing about. Seeing this again reminds me of other kinds of activities, and I think you're going to talk about this a bit, Scott, in a minute, but just to throw it in while it's relevant here.
Yeah, of course.
Gaming. There is a RISD Brown gaming club, and there are students who've been very, very active in that, and in fact, through their activity have had companies come visit and talk to them on behalf of the club. So even a mention on your resume about being an active member or maybe having a leadership role in a club like that, as it pertains to your strengths and your interests and kind of your professional direction, is really logical. And a resume is a great place to indicate that kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think it's a great point. And that's like, I think that's a perfect illustration or a perfect example of how If you get outside of like this, the idea of a job or internship and think holistically and really think about all of your activities at RISD, there's potentially lots of opportunity for you to craft a really robust and full resume that really does have a lot of relevant experience that employers care about. So I think it's a great point, Susan. So we just sort of finished talking a little bit about, how do you think about all of your experiences and make sure that you're thinking about the things that you've done that are relevant to your audience. It's also important that you describe those effectively, right? It's one thing to list them on the resume, but then you have to kind of describe their value. So I like to think about that as almost connecting the dots for your employer. So there's like the experience over here and the employers over here, and you want the description to sort of like bring those two things together so that it makes a seamless connection. The employer can see the value of the experience and the problem. So a couple of things to note when you're describing experiences. So again, looking at this Xavier Williams kind of illustration gaming example, one thing is you want to have a consistent format for how you're showing experiences. So in this case, we see employer, so Our Earth LLC, we see the position, game design intern, and we see the date involved. It happened in 2018. And that's repeated as you go through this gaming experience category. It's repeated. And that, it seems subtle and seems kind of straightforward, but that's actually quite important because it gets your reader in a flow. They know how information is going to be delivered, and so it makes it for an easy reading experience for them. And it's visually just pleasing as well. So it sounds simple and it's subtle, and in a way it is, but it is still quite important. So you just want to land on a way that you're showing information and then stick with it. And this is a good example, one you can use. Beyond that, as we zoom in, you want to consider what am I actually saying? How am I describing this experience, right? And I think the key thing here, there's no, perfect length, or there's no magic bullet exactly for how to do this. But there are some things to keep in mind. So the key thing is you want to use these descriptions as a way to show translatable knowledge and skills. So if we read this, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll pull out a couple things. They talk about how they established art direction and produced illustrated assets for weekly builds while maintaining consistency, quality, and pace, distributed tasks to team members based on individual skill sets, and solved UI, design, and technical challenges within the team. So in the way that they're describing their experiences, they're pulling out specific tasks and skills that they used as an artist intern at Boston Digi Summer Innovation Program. So they're making sure that they're pulling out key skills and abilities as they're describing what they did. So that's like one key thing you want to keep in mind. As I said, there's no perfect length, and lengths do vary depending on maybe how long or how valuable the experience was to you. That's one reason why it might vary. Also, it might vary sometimes even just depending on how much space you have on your resume. You might have to make some trimming decisions here and there. So not every experience is going to be 3 to 4 sentences or 3 to 4 lines. Some might be slightly longer than others. But I do advise 3 to 4 lines or 3 to 4 sentences as like a good balance, where you're likely to have a description that's effective, that has enough substance, that is showing translatable knowledge and skills, but it's probably not so long that people are getting bogged down or it's difficult for them to read, or the resume is feeling dense or too chunky, so to speak. So it's a guideline, but you can go outside of that guideline. I think these are some additional key tips to think about when you're describing your experiences. So one key thing is you generally want to start sentences with these verbs or these action words to really draw your reader's attention to the skills that you have. So some examples: created, designed, illustrated, curated, collaborated, fabricated. Say that 5 times fast. So these are drawing these singular words, right? These are all just one words, but they really draw the reader's attention to specific things that you know how to do. So that's something you want to integrate. Not only do you want to use that active versus passive language, but try to be specific, try to be somewhat detailed. So kind of a contrast here. I'll say the one that's sort of very bland and generic first. So you could have a description that said something like, tasks included brand identity redesign for multiple clients. It says something that describes the experience a little bit. However, I would say it kind of pales in comparison and is actually not as effective or compelling as designed original concepts for lettering style brand identities for multiple fashion and lifestyle industry clients, including Fenty, Opening Ceremony, and Eckhouse Lotta. So those are the same experience, but one is much more descriptive and much more compelling because it goes into slightly more detail and also, you know, provides information about the type of clients or type of people they were doing work for. So you can always like ask yourself questions when you're working through this as to, am I leaving out information or is there critical information that I could add here? Third point. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add to this. I think when I talk with students, sometimes the idea of describing what they did just becomes, you know, very lengthy because there were many things that they did. So my recommendation is always you know, there's a lot that you did, but out of that range of experience you had, what are, in your view, like the 3 most important things that you did? So again, bringing this idea of focus back to your resume and who's your audience and what do you want them to know about you. First and foremost, this is the chance. You know, the description of what you've done in the past is your chance to really hone in on the things that you cared about most in that job and to describe them in this active way that you're describing.
Yep.
So I just wanted to say, if it feels difficult, as you set to task to do this, there's a reason why. It is surprisingly difficult, and though it can be challenging, hopefully we're giving you some guidance to dispel some of the challenges and to help you think in a way that will kind of arrive at the right kinds of summaries for your job descriptions or internship descriptions and other material that's going to go on your resume.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Susan's point there is sort of that last bullet that you see on the screen, which is, you know, consider ranking or ordering your description, right? So like you have different sentences or different tasks, like rank them, prioritize them, and then that might help you potentially cut out things that are not as critical or as important if you feel like you're in a situation where you have to cut or make room. The last 2 things I want to say really quickly, another thing that can help with effectively describing experiences, like try to point to specific outcomes or quantify if possible. It's not always possible, but an example of what I mean by that is like, here's a description below, that you co-created an educational curriculum and programming series for the museum education department focused on engaging youth who are underrepresented in the arts. The series led to a 10% increase in youth attendance at the museum and increased volunteer applications. So we kind of we defined what the person did, co-creating the curriculum, and then the next line sort of talks about outcomes and sort of shows its value. You can't always do that, but you can at least try to kind of talk about the purpose or talk about what was the possible value or hopeful value of what you were contributing. So the idea there is that you're not just talking about what you did, but you're showing the value of what you did. That's an important part. And that's useful here on a resume, and it's also going to be useful later on in cover letter writing and just in interviews and things like that. So it's a good habit to get into. And then last but not least, take a peek at job and internship postings in the industries or markets that you're interested in working in, and just look at the language that's used. Like kind of use it as a guide in a sense, because if you can see, like in this example that's on the screen, a concept artist, and you see like that they want somebody who can craft detailed concept art by ideating, sketching, and iterating new character concepts in collaboration with others, or utilize knowledge of human and animal anatomical drawing to develop realistic concept renderings. If you're seeing patterns, right, if you see that consistently in the kinds of jobs that you're applying to, you can borrow some of that language in your own resume descriptions, of course, if you have done those things. I'm not saying make it up, but you can use industry standard terminology and terms, which is going to help your resume resonate with your audience better because they're going to recognize these skills and abilities because it's typical in the industry, right? So that's kind of a guide or a trick that you can use when looking for the right language. The other guide or trick that you can use is we had mentioned at the very beginning that there's a section of our website that has this PDF where you can look at these models that we've been referencing. It also has this list of action words that you can refer to. So if you're ever stuck with how to describe an experience, this could be a good thing to turn to as well. So outside of describing experiences, another thing to keep in mind, we've sort of alluded to this a little bit, but the importance of organizing experiences or creating a hierarchy for your reader or viewer. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So this example that we've been looking at with James Yamamoto, you'll notice they have two different experience categories. And I'll just kind of go back. So if you look at the right side of the page here is really all experiences. And they've prioritized this creative experience category first, and then they have this additional experience category. So the creative experience category, they've decided I'm going to pack this section with all things that are, creative, that are illustration or design oriented experiences. Essentially, they're saying, I think my audience is going to care most about these experiences. So I'm putting them towards the top of the resume by creating this category for them. They also have these additional experiences right below. And that's, if you look at it, it's essentially an office assistant, and it's a work study position in the Career Center. And also a design for US, kind of a student club type experience. And they still want these on the resume, but they've put them in this kind of like secondary category of additional experience because they're saying to their audience, I want you to see these, they have value, they show that I've been busy, they show that I've held this work study job and can be professional, and they also show that I'm involved and engaged with the student community and also a student leader as part of this club, but they're not as critical as these creative experiences. Mm-hmm. So sometimes you can play with categories. You control this resume, so you can create categories to create a hierarchy and highlight things or spotlight things for your audience. And this is an example of a way to do that.
I have a little, I guess, example to illustrate, Scott, this point.
Please.
Exactly. So I was having a conversation with a recruiter for a well-known animation company last summer, and I asked the question about, so if you get over 300 applicants for an internship, how do you go through them? Like, what causes you to choose one resume over another? How do you make your decisions? And I was actually really surprised at the answer that I got. And the recruiter said, well, if I see that there's a student who's got a great portfolio and they've also worked as an RA, or they've had a work study job on campus or a second job in addition to the classes that they're taking, I know how hard that is to have multiple jobs and to be a student. And I'm immediately interested in this applicant because they're telling me that they have an incredible work ethic. And if they've been a student leader of any kind, leadership ability is applicable in a lot of different ways and a lot of different scenarios here in our studio. So the message here is don't undervalue experiences that you have on campus, whether you're an orientation leader or you're a resident advisor or you're a teaching assistant or you have another work study job in another office on campus. All these things can count, and for some they really do count a lot. So just to reinforce that point of don't minimize all the good things that you've done. Be selective in how you talk about them and highlight the key skills that you used, and know that it will be your advantage.
Well said. So as we move down, next category that you're probably going to want to incorporate would be a skills category. And this is, similar to experiences in that it's, showing what you know, and it's an important category, but you usually go about it in a little bit of a different way. So back to the Maria Santos kind of art administrator, or student who's aspiring to be an art administrator type example. And I think what they want is really important to consider here. So again, this is somebody who's trying to work at a nonprofit art center and trying to utilize skills that are relevant to art administration. So their skills sort of reflect that goal. So when we go down and look at the skills section, they've kind of subcategorized their skills to match what they're trying to do. So they've even created this art administration subcategory of skills where they talk about their knowledge of contemporary art, historical art movements, curatorial practice, fundraising, marketing, budgeting, etc. So they're basically saying to their audience, here are the skills that I have that match the work that happens in your environment. It's a really effective way to go about it. But they also have these other categories as well, like a computer or a software category where they're showing the Adobe Creative Suite, and they also happen to have some coding skills. So that could be valuable if the nonprofit needs to develop a website or has technology needs of some kind. So you still want to include software and computer skills 100%. It's actually really important. And then maybe a category like a language. Again, if you're fluent in multiple languages beyond just English, that can be a great thing to have in a skills category and can help set you apart. Being bilingual can be a really, really important skill, especially depending on the place. But if you work or are trying to work in a large kind of multinational type corporation, it can be incredibly valuable. Or if you're trying to work with communities where there are commonly spoken languages beyond English, these are all really important reasons to speak multiple languages, and it definitely can be a great way to show that skill there as well. The one other thing I would show with skills too is just, and this is a conversation I have with students sometimes, is software is really important. So you need to have your computer or software knowledge on here. It absolutely should be in this section, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it should be the only thing. And so one of the things you saw with Maria with the art administration skills, and you see here with Xavier, is they also have another section or subcategory that shows either traditional kind of non-digital skills. So in this case, since they're trying to work in gaming, they're showing their sort of illustration and drawing skills. So character and environment design, game design, landscape painting, figure and observational drawing, et cetera, et cetera. So don't just get too overly focused on software where you neglect these other skills that are maybe traditional skills, but important techniques in any given creative position. So make sure that you're paying attention to those as well. Kind of the last thing in this traditional resume, the awards, honors, and exhibitions category, or for this kind of resume, what I like to think of as kind of bonus or icing on the cake, really good things to have, but they're sort of going to be in a lower or kind of secondary position on the resume most of the time. So in this example, again, the Xavier Williams example, you'll see they have this achievements category in the lower left-hand section, and they've broken it out to represent both honors and exhibitions. We'll just be real quick on this, but basically this can be short and sweet and to the point. So you can really just, for example, exhibitions, for example, just have what was the title of the show, the venue or place that the work was shown, and when did it get shown? What was the year that it took place? Honors can be similar with the title of the award, the name of the organization who awarded it, and the year. So it's really short, sweet, and to the point. But as I said, it can be absolutely be a bonus and really beneficial thing to have. It's just usually for this kind of a resume comes after experience and skills in the hierarchy of things. So just to summarize real quick for this kind of resume, key things to do. Identify your target audience or audiences. It's okay to have different audiences. You might craft different resumes for different audiences, but figure out who you want to be applying to and then determine what they want to see and build the resume accordingly. So you want to assess, what have you done as it relates to your audience or as it relates to your goals. Make sure that those main strengths and main skills are clearly communicated on your resume. As I said before, take some time to maybe research some job postings in the areas you're interested in so you can get familiar with key terminology and skills that you might incorporate on your resume. And describing experiences, attempt to describe your experiences, in that 3 to 4 line range. Again, it's not set in stone. You can go outside of that, but it's a nice balance of showing value, but also being relatively brief. So those are some key takeaways for this kind of resume.
One final thought to add to that, Scott, is that when we were talking about this the other day, I mentioned that I often refer to the resume as sort of the blueprint for what may come up in an interview, or the the topics that you might be asked about to elaborate on in an interview. And it also sets up your audience or your reader for expectation of what they'll see in your portfolio. So if you think about both your resume and portfolio sort of working together, it can help guide a little bit how you would make reference to your skills on your resume, how you would describe the kinds of experiences that you're listing on your resume. So the end point is that information leads me to have some immediate thoughts about what I'm going to see in your portfolio, and I want to go look at it.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
that's the goal, is to go from resume to portfolio to, I'm going to call this person for an interview because I'm really intrigued by all of this. So just keep in mind that your resume is part of this bigger package, and it can work to your advantage to think about how it works with your portfolio, as well as how it will work with your cover letter, which we're going to get.
Terrific, terrific points, Susan. So pivoting now to the other, we mentioned the other two kinds of resumes. So we're going to touch on those two versions really quickly. These will go through a little bit more quickly than the traditional resume, just because they are actually maybe a little more straightforward. Doesn't mean that they don't deserve attention, of course, but they're a little bit easier to absorb, I think, and kind of understand the principles behind them. So we'll start with the exhibition resume, which would be used, as we said before, for applying to calls for an artist or an open call or call for entry, a grant application, or perhaps an application to a residency. So just the same way as we did for the other version of your resume, we'll just kind of quickly go through the key sections. So some of this is going to be similar to the other version, but there are some key distinctions as well. So header is the same. That's where you'd start and make sure that your name and contact info and even link to your online portfolio are really easily visible and legible. You'd also still kind of go next with the education section. And then this is where it starts to get a little different, where the next important category does really become, in most cases, a listing of your exhibition history. Then you might, if you have them, highlight any artistic awards or past grants or residencies that you have been a part of. If you're lucky enough to have any press, anybody who's ever written about your work or a show that you've been involved in, you can include that information there as well. And then you'd follow on with experience. So professional experiences, work experiences, internships, that kind of a thing would be one of the final aspects of this type of resume. So to sort of help visualize this, and I think it's important to keep in mind as you see this version, this is a good model, but it's also somebody who's had an extensive career, a professional career as a fine artist. This is not somebody who's still in school or even a recent graduate. This is somebody who's been working for 10 plus years or more. So just keep that in mind. I don't want anybody to be intimidated by this and feel like their fine art resume has to look like this or their exhibition resume has to look like this right now. This is essentially the goal for most people, but it is helpful to kind of see how it's structured and laid out. So one of the things you'll notice is after education, really it goes into their exhibition history. Now, this person has been lucky enough to have some solo exhibitions in addition to group exhibitions, so they've separated that out. That can be a good idea if you've had a significant amount of solo exhibitions. Most people, however, especially if you're a student or a recent grad, you probably will just group all of your exhibitions together because you may not have had enough solo exhibitions at this point in your career to have a solo category dedicated to it, and that's okay. But you would have a category of selected or exhibitions in a prominent position on the resume, and it's probably the most important thing. In this case, we're calling it bibliography. It's another term for it, but really you could call it a press section as well, where you might be highlighting any writing that's ever been done about you. And again, I think, for current students, you may not have a ton of this, but even if it doesn't have to be like, somebody in Art Forum wrote about your work, it could be a lesser known blog or a lesser known publication or online magazine or something like that. That's still legitimate. So I think it could be something that's print, it could be something that's digital. And I think you can get, especially at this point in your career, you can be somewhat liberal with what you include here. So that's just to say it does not have to be the art forums of the world that you're listing here necessarily, especially early on in your career. Any kind of press or coverage is probably legitimate at this point. And then, as we said before, another important category, listing awards or grants that you've received, as well as in this example, they've crafted out a category for residencies that they've been a part of. That can kind of fill out an important section of this resume. But what you notice in totality, right, is that for this resume, what we're putting the emphasis on is really their artistic achievements, their artistic track record. First and foremost with shows, followed on by people, critics and whatnot who have covered their work, and then any artistic awards or grants or residencies that they've been accepted into or been awarded. So we're really highlighting the artistic track record, and then in a slightly secondary way, we're then talking about work experience. It's sort of an additional category on this type of resume. In this case, this person has teaching experience. It doesn't have to be teaching experience, though. It could be any kind of work experience. And I think, Susan, you may want to chime in. I know you have thoughts about like how students, especially when they're starting out, how they can try to kind of have a hybrid approach to building this kind of resume.
Yeah, you're a mind reader.
We must have talked about this presentation before.
Yeah, we have. So one thing actually literally just dawned on me as you were presenting this, Scott, to say, I know that there are students who have co-curated shows together.
Yes.
And that experience is so impressive to me. The way students, for one thing, have just been able to produce those kinds of events is remarkable. And the writing that comes along with it about the show itself.
Yep.
So my point is, when we're talking about listing exhibitions, if you have co-curated a show, it would be very acceptable to go beyond just the name of the show and the gallery name, but to really indicate your level of involvement as a co-curator or as a curator of a show, and to give a synopsis of what that show is about in a sentence, you know, a brief description. So I just wanted to highlight that. I think it's important to really maximize those kinds of self-initiated experiences and not overlook the importance, obviously, of it. The other thought that comes to mind with especially an exhibition resume is that in the absence of having a lot of experiences showing your work, it's quite likely, and I would imagine for most students, surely the case, that you have an artist statement that you've developed and or are developing, and it would be very appropriate to include your artist statement as part of your exhibition resume, because again, it begins to give somebody a really good sense of where you're coming from with the work that you're making. And if you're applying to a residency program or for a call to entry, for example, really giving the viewer a sense of what your work is about and how you describe that can immediately put, you know, a frame of reference around it for their high consideration of your application. So I think, to, you know, your point, Scott, all throughout this talk, really this is about creating a document, whether it's a resume, a CV, or an exhibition resume, that speaks to who you are, what your strengths are, what your focus is, and framing that in a way that you feel is like a good reflection of who you are. So I think those are the main points to make about the exhibition resume, especially.
Excellent closing point. So last version is that CV, or again, that kind of like academic teaching position type resume, or applying to an academic teaching position type resume, I should say. So again, some similar formatting elements as what we've seen before, but really a couple of key differences. So starting with a header and education section still makes sense. However, then you're going to want to, for this version, you're going to want to pivot to highlighting your teaching experiences. So teaching experiences including teaching assistant, TA roles, or if you're lucky enough to be the instructor of record for any positions. I think one thing of note, like sometimes grad students at RISD will have the opportunity, I should say, to teach a winter session course and be the solo instructor or co-instructor for that type of course. I think that's a good example of when you could list that type of experience on your CV or teaching resume. Following on from that teaching experience section would be either your exhibition history if you're a fine artist applying to fine art teaching positions, or probably your design experience or design work history if you're a designer applying to design-oriented teaching positions. And then kind of icing on the cake type elements like awards, grants, and residencies, or additional other kinds of work experiences. So to illustrate this, what this might look like, and actually what you're seeing on the screen too, before we even talk about specifics, you'll notice this version is 2 pages, and a CV can be longer. A CV is, in fact, even kind of expected to be longer than your typical one-page resume. So we mentioned earlier, there are exceptions to that one-page resume rule. This is one of those exceptions. You still want to be concise. You still don't want to, you know, pack a resume just for the sake of packing it, or pack a CV just for the sake of packing it. But it is okay to go beyond the one-page limit with a CV. And as your career develops, that in fact is something you may do. But in this version, you'll notice after education, they jump right into highlighting these teaching experiences where they have been an assistant and associate professor in the past. But like I said, even if you don't have that level of experience, this is where you would put things like being a TA or being an instructor of a winter session course. And I would say even, though ideally we're focusing on college level teaching positions here, any kind of teaching or education experience is probably relevant for this category. So even if you've taught, you know, as maybe in a mentor as part of an art nonprofit, something like an AS 220 in Providence, or an after school teaching program of some kind, it's still probably relevant to include in this category as well, because it does show teaching ability and teaching acumen. The other thing you'll notice on here, it's not highlighted so much, but right below teaching experience is a teaching competencies and interests category, where essentially in this case, they're talking about the filmmaking and filming techniques that they're comfortable teaching. That's another category that you could consider adding, is like, what areas or techniques or subjects are you comfortable teaching in? That's another thing that you could consider adding to your CV as well. It's not mandatory, but it could be an additional category you might consider. But once you've tackled those kind of teaching experiences and teaching competencies, it would then pivot to either, like I said, your exhibition history, if you're a fine artist, or your working history, if you're more of a designer. That's typically how that kind of breaks down, and it does depend on the discipline that you're applying in. In this example, it's a cinematography or a film history, you know, a history, a filmography, a history of the films that they've produced, because this is somebody who's applying to a filmmaking position. So, Susan, any quick comments or thoughts on that?
Just one final note is just a quick mention that the College Art Association is a professional organization, that if you are thinking about teaching at the college level, we would highly encourage you to take a look at the website. And I think it is collegeart.org. And they have a host of resources at their website. And among them are examples of different types of CV formats. So very extensive, very rich in detail, and just a great complement to what we're talking about with you this afternoon, today, I should say. Don't know what time it is when
it could be any time. That's the beauty of this. So as we kind of head into the final section of what we're going to be talking about today, we're kind of pivoting away from resumes and now going to talk about cover letters, which is also a really important part of your application package, and is a chance for you to be a little bit more narrative, and you can even control the focus of your viewer or of your reader in an even maybe more powerful way than you could do on the resume in some respects. So it's just another chance for you to impress and highlight things for the employer. So we're going to talk about how you can do that. And so the phrase that you see on the screen, it's kind of like a one-sided interview that you control. I think the idea with that phrase is that you can think about this as, okay, I've got a job or an internship description in front of me that I'm applying to. I know what they want, or at least have a good idea of what they want based upon what they're saying. And I get to craft this message that basically says, here's why I'm a good fit for what you want. And so you're kind of controlling the message, which is a really cool, it's a great opportunity when you think about it. And it's important to take advantage of that opportunity. So as we did with the resume, like, you might, before you even put pen to paper or start typing, because nobody really puts pen to paper anymore, we want to think about some key questions to get us started. So one, if you actually could sum it up in one key question, you might want to think about this one. If you could only share 2 or 3 max specific reasons why you're the ideal candidate, so if you could share to the employer these 2 or 3 specific things, what would you choose, or what would you say? What would you highlight about yourself? That's one way you can start to brainstorm what you'll say in the cover letter. Just kind of different spins on that same idea. What skills do you have that directly connect with what that employer is seeking? So again, matching up your skills maybe to the skills that they're asking for in an intern or job posting. Similar idea, but with experience. What experiences from your resume do you think are most important to your audience that match up with what they're asking for? Similar idea, just another different spin. What studios or classes have you taken that might illustrate those skills or knowledge that you need for the position? That might be a particularly helpful way to approach it. If you don't have a lot of past internship or working experience, you can focus on highlighting studios or classes, similar to what we were talking about with how to do that in the resume. And then this last one, so all the questions prior to this on this page have been about you. What do you bring? And that's an important part. But this last one is thinking more about them. So why do you want to work for this organization in particular? What about this place? Why do you want to be a part of this team? Is it their body of work, their portfolio, in other words? Is it their mission or their values? Is there an alumni connection? Maybe it's an alumni-owned studio. Maybe it's an artist or designer who's a RISD alum, and that's partly why you want to be there. There's no right answer to this. There are all potential ways you could think about it, or ways you could explain why you want to be a part of them, or a part of their organization, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
So once you've had some time to digest those, I think it's helpful to do that first, ask yourself those key questions, and then you can think about, how do I structure this? How do I actually craft this message with these ideas in mind? So first things first, this should be relatively short and sweet. So a cover letter, you really want to aim for a message that's in 3 to 4 paragraph range. Again, not set in stone, doesn't have to be 3 or 4 paragraphs, but that's a general good range to shoot for. But you definitely want to keep it shorter than a page, unless requested otherwise, unless they're asking for something that's longer explicitly. That's pretty rare. I've seen it a few times, but most of the time, either in an email or a formal cover letter, you want to keep it pretty short in this 3 to 4 paragraph range.
Probably the only exception to that, Scott,
Yep.
I would say, is if you're applying for a teaching position,
Mm-hmm.
a college level teaching position, and then the application requirements are pretty specific, and you would quickly realize that you need to be more comprehensive in that initial application letter.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Susan. And I think it kind of connects nicely with the way we were talking about the CV, actually, because in the way we were talking about the CV was, it's your teaching experience is really important, and then your professional experience, right? Whether that's like exhibition history or work experience. So those are like 2 critical factors in the CV. And so they actually kind of become important factors in the cover letter as well. And so it may need to be a little longer. To your point, that kind of justifies it being a little longer, because there needs to be more information. So I think that's a really good point. But typically, or most of the time, you're going to want to keep it shorter. And I sometimes like to, when I'm working with students, talk about it in really these 2 kind of main ways, or think about it as you've really got 2 main goals in your cover letter, if you really break it down and distill it down to its most simple form. And that's essentially answering these 2 questions, which is, why them? In other words, you want to give specific reasons why you want to be a part of the organization that you're applying to. Why do you, of all the places that you could intern, or all the places that you could work for, why do you want to work there? There should be a reason, right? There should be a draw to that opportunity, to that place, and you want to be able to articulate that to them. You want them to feel connected to you and feel like you'll be a good part of the team because you get what's happening there. And then flipping that on kind of on its head, once you've addressed why you want to be there, you want to explain to them why they should want you, by citing specific examples of past experiences that justify your ability to do the job. So if you think about your mission in this cover letter is to answer those 2 questions in a compelling way. Why do you want to be there? Why do you want to work there? And why should they want to work with you? Or why are you a good fit for the job? If you can accomplish those 2 things, chances are you're writing an effective cover letter. So if you think about how to break that down and do it, what's the kind of structure you want to use? This simple 3-part structure is a helpful outline. So you would have an introduction, a pitch, and then a closing. It's actually quite simple when you break it down. So we're going to look at an example, kind of recycling back to the Maria Santos example. This is the resume we've been looking at, and then there's a cover letter that's actually paired, where the cover letter is referencing experiences in the resume, and this kind of goes back to that PDF that you can all look at any time. So as I mentioned, the three-part structure, the first part is the introduction. So this is really typically short and to the point. In this message, you might want to consider mentioning that you're a RISD student or that you've recently graduated from RISD, so kind of highlighting the RISD education. Your passion for the work of that organization that you're applying to, again, kind of the why them part of this, and excitement for applying to the specific position. So here's what that might look like. So again, this is Maria's cover letter. So to the Brooklyn Creative Arts Exchange team, as a socially engaged artist who believes in open access to the arts for all, I've been following the Brooklyn Creative Arts Exchange for some time. I have long admired your organization as a hub for NYC youth and professional artists to share space, thoughts, and resources. In particular, I am compelled by your Speak Up program, which brings together performance artists and local youth to create work that resonates with the community and stimulates dialogue. This type of exposure to the arts is crucial for young people and was an essential part of my own development as an artist. I hope I can create more of these types of experiences as the arts program associate at Brooklyn Creative Arts Exchange. So again, just kind of like thinking back to what we were talking about with an introduction, they establish, what they do really well here, in my opinion, is they establish a connection to the organization. They reference this specific Speak Up program that they admire, and they talk about why it's valuable. They also make it personal by talking about how those types of programs were really meaningful and important to them when they were growing up. So they establish a really strong connection with the organization early on and address why they want to be a part of developing this kind of programming, in this case, as an arts program associate, essentially the position they're applying to. After that quick introduction, you then want to move into the pitch. And this is a really, really critical part of the cover letter. And you can think about this as a section where you can aim to tell short stories, very short stories, but short stories that illustrate your skills and experiences that translate to the role. So it's kind of that old adage of showing versus telling. So through these short stories that you talk about, you're hopefully showing the skills and abilities you have that connect to the job. It's sort of proving that you have the ability to do the job, in other words. So here's an example of how one does that. In my time as an undergraduate student in the painting department at RISD, I've been intentional about seeking out opportunities to expand my skills as an artist and administrator. I've had multiple experiences working for nonprofits, including internships at the Brent Howell Art Foundation and the City Children's Museum in Providence. At Brent Howell in particular, I co-led an initiative to curate work by both students in the program and affiliated professional artists for a community-facing exhibition. This project involves significant research, scheduling, and coordination. Furthermore, I also understand the life of a working artist, a perspective I gained in part from my role as a studio assistant for internationally exhibited artist Atulya Ganesh. This understanding would allow me to thrive in the associate role when collaborating with local artists. So again, this idea of telling short stories here, they do that effectively. They're telling two quick stories about work that they did at the Brent Howell Foundation, curating work by students in the program and professional artists to create an exhibition. And then they're also telling a quick story about their studio assistant role for a prominent artist, and basically saying that through that role, that sort of demonstrates that they'd be able to work with artists really well because they've worked with artists in the past, right? So they're using these two quick examples to sort of show like, hey, I can do this job that you have because I've done aspects of it before. I can prove that I have the skills needed to do this. Then the last simple, quick and easy, but still very important paragraph that comes last is the closing. And this really is quite simple. You just want to reiterate your enthusiasm for the position. You want to give thanks, appreciation that they're considering you. That, you know, it's the human element, but it goes a long way to sort of be appreciative and give thanks, and people will appreciate that. So it's worth taking the time to do it. And perhaps even mention your ability to elaborate on your background or your experience, or just share more about yourself in an interview in the future. So again, really short, but something like, I believe deeply that I can contribute to the meaningful work happening at Brooklyn Creative Arts Exchange. The values of your organization pair perfectly with my own. I truly hope I can join you in spreading those values and look forward to the chance to speak with you more about the position. So again, that kind of last line of egging them or nudging them towards an interview or another follow-on conversation. It's gentle, it's not demanding or anything, but it's a nice push in the right direction. So really, those categories of introduction, pitch, and closing, that's really what makes up an effective cover letter. And for any of these elements, whether it's a cover letter or it's a resume, you can come and speak with us and talk to us in more detail about any of these things at any time, but also you can get advice 24/7 at the Career Center website. As you're seeing on the screen, this is a snapshot of our site, and there's a whole career prep section which has advice and guidance for a number of important career topics, resume and cover letter included in there. Susan, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know if before we kind of end, I don't know if you have any thoughts or any additions on the cover letter aspect. I'm happy to kind of go back if you wanted to know anything or not. Sorry to kind of put you on the spot, but I realize I moved quickly there.
That is fine. I think the one thing that I would add to thinking about the cover letter is that, and you've covered it beautifully, Scott, but just to say, conversations with students are leading me to this point, that I think so often, especially when applying for internships, the point of view is from the student how much they would gain by being exposed to a particular environment or to having a particular type of work experience, and that's implicit, really implied in an internship. And the points that you're making about the things that you bring and why you would want to bring those skill sets to a particular internship or job are really critical. It's just, I can't emphasize that enough. The only other small detail to add on the cover letter, I think, is that in other instances, where in the case of Maria, she's applying for an arts admin position, but if you were applying for a design position or a visual art type of position, that closing would probably include a link to your portfolio website.
Yes.
So that, as you know, that first initial application goes out with the resume and a really well-crafted letter of introduction or cover letter, you want them ultimately to take a look at your work, and they probably want to as well.
Yep.
So adding this as like the reminder at the very end of the closing on the cover letter is an important point. They'll find the link on the resume too, but it's your job to make sure that they don't miss that, and really, inviting them to take a look in your closing is a wise idea. So I think those are the only 2 points to make. And thanks so much, Scott, for an amazing presentation. And I really appreciate the viewing audience who's out there to also thank you for your time and also interest in really trying to do a good job in representing yourself.
Absolutely, and thank you, Susan, as well. I think it was great to tag team with you on this, and I think it felt really good from my end. I hope everybody on the other side feels the same way. Last little note I'll say is, and I kind of mentioned this, but we are available for remote meetings or for remote drop-ins during this time. Like much of the RISD campus, we're using Zoom right now. So you can go to our website, as we said, in the Meet Us section, and schedule either a remote advising session, or there's also information there on the drop-in hours. And bottom line, the main thing is really we're still here to support you 100%. And if you want to follow up with Susan or myself or anybody in our team for more questions about resumes or cover letters or anything else, don't hesitate to do it. And otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and we appreciate it. Take care.
Yeah. Take care.